Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, coming at you live to talk about the brilliance of the villain, the brilliance of Kylo Ren as depicted in The Last Jedi. This was a conversational piece that was really sort of born out of my previous Last Jedi video talking about the air quotes problems people had with the characterization of Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, and I spent a half an hour just sort of ranting and discussing that. I did repeat myself a couple of times, but I gave some analogies as to why, in my estimation, it made perfect sense. This is 30 years on from where we left Luke in The Return of the Jedi, the final scene in Return of the Jedi. And, this is 30 more years of his life that he lived, that he was chasing down Jedi relics and coming to understand the transgressions and the misconceptions to do with them. And then he is confronted with Ben Solo. He takes Ben under his wing as given, sort of joie de vivre, by Han and Leia, his parents, to teach him and to try to mold him into this respectable, benevolent sort of Jedi figure, which is a misnomer. It's a complete misconception on what the Jedi actually became. And if you look at the prequel trilogy, you have a full estimation of all of that, all of the bad side of that, with Palpatine, coming to power and the rise of the Empire and the Darths, the Sith, the darkness, all of that stuff. And I talked about all of this for the most part in that video, talking about people's issues with Luke and just trying to explain to them, how it actually makes sense, how your estimation of it, if you have preconceptions and preconceived notions as to who he is, what he amounts to, where we left him is the last impression you have on him, you're missing the bigger picture. And it was a level of his failing Ben, his failing to realize how imperfect the Jedi Order actually was back in the day. It was his own fears out of what Ben was, had become at that point, as well as the fears within himself. If he was still able to show that weakness, if he had still, even for a fleeting moment, had the capability of going dark and potentially taking Ben out, what did that mean for him? It meant that he was very much still open to being manipulated by a Snoke or something like that, and being weaponized, being turned into a sort of Mark II of what his father had become, Darth Vader. And so it was all of these things, a whole bunch of things, a conglomeration of ideas and mindsets and thought processes that made him go into hiding, go into self-imposed exile. And what the conversation I want to focus on in this video, though, is that moment, that fleeting moment of weakness where he considered killing Kylo, because it speaks to the grander scheme of who Kylo Ren is, who Ben Solo once was, who he became as Kylo Ren, and how he is such a compelling villain, especially within the Star Wars universe, because he's done something very simply that has never been done before, at least from a sort of Darth Vader standpoint, the sort of Darth Vader figure, if you will. We understand that Anakin Skywalker, there was always a confliction within him, and there was some light that was still within him, and this is something that Luke sensed, and he was able to bring, his father back. But there's a lot of sort of, poor estimations of the fact that Luke would have that moment of weakness in The Last Jedi where he would contemplate, eschewing once and for all the darkness that had consumed his nephew. He shouldn't, in most people's estimations, he shouldn't have ever even remotely considered, even for just that fleeting moment, taking Ben's life. And people are trying to wrap their minds around the miscommunication, the misinformation that's going on in The Last Jedi, where we see a Ben or a Kylo who still has internal conflict. And so, as per a conversation in the comments I had on that video, we've really been working toward fleshing this out a little more, me and two other people. And I feel like we have the purest estimation of the villainous side of Ben Solo, who is now Kylo Ren, fully formed. And you go back to that moment when, Luke had that fleeting moment of weakness and confusion and uncertainty, and just, for milliseconds thought, maybe I should quell this evil now. In that moment, what a lot of people I don't think understand is that Ben had fully, been persuaded to the dark side by Snoke at that point. He was fully consumed with darkness and evil and everything like that. With finding out about his grandfather being Vader and all these kinds of things. And I'm sure there are, questions overhanging as to why. How was he so seduced? How did he become so consumed with that darkness? And hopefully, in episode 9, we'll delve more into where his mind was. But for all intents and purposes, the thing to take away from it is there was only a sort of maybe very minor inkling, a granular inkling within Ben of any sort of conflict or anything like that. It had almost entirely been eschewed. And so he was ready to commit to Snoke's persuasions, the darkness and everything like that. All it took at that point was Luke's brief hesitation and brief confusion, his moment of weakness where he considered for just seconds, trying to quell that evil before it could spill out into the galaxy, and Ben caught him. And that was provocation enough, as minor and minute as it needed to be at that point, for him to fully commit to the black space, to the dark side, to Snoke's persuasions and everything like that. It was just the one little nudge he needed to fully commit to everything that had already coursed through his body, mind, and soul. And so we have, Ben come Kylo, who is beyond saving for the most part. He still has some level of conflict, which we see him quell out well and truly, thoroughly, once and for all, in The Force Awakens when he is confronted with Han Solo, his father. Any even brief estimation of internal conflict that still resided within Ben Solo, within Kylo Ren at that point, when confronted with his father, and he, ignited his lightsaber through his father's gut, murdering, taking the life of Han Solo, his father. This was his putting the cap on the bottle once and for all. He had already been well and truly consumed and persuaded to the dark side by Snoke, and he was ready to commit to it. It just took looking up and seeing Luke bearing down on him with an ignited lightsaber, ready to strike, perhaps, maybe, and it was enough. The impressions that Snoke had put into his mind that Luke was not to be trusted, that he need follow the dark path. He need understand Darth Vader before him, his grandfather before him, and all this kind of stuff. And how that is really, in a sense, a twisted sense, the righteous path for Ben, for Kylo. All of that was already internal to him. And you have a lot of people in The Last Jedi who can sense, well, not a lot, 3, Luke, Rey, and Leia, his mother, who can sense that he is beyond saving. And yet you have the conflictual bit of dialogue from Snoke who's explaining to Rey, there is still some conflict in him. I sensed the conflict in him. What Snoke is really saying at that point is he knew that there was conflict when Kylo first fought back against Luke and killed the Jedi, people who were in training, and took the Knights of Ren, those who decided to go with him. And for all intents and purposes, he had thought he had murdered his uncle, murdered Luke Skywalker. There was still just a granular amount of confliction within him, of hesitation within him. And so in The Force Awakens, he is able to finally, once and for all, quell and confront that in the face of his father, whose life he takes, and forever removes any of that confliction ever again. He's still very much hot-headed, he's still very easily brought to boil and all these things, but the hesitation, the confliction with the death of his father at his own hand, silenced any of that confliction forevermore. But then you say, okay, well, what about in The Last Jedi, when Snoke is saying, I sensed the confliction in him and everything like that? What, through this conversation I've had with these other couple of guys in the comments, what we've come to understand is, based on what we see in the dialogue, Snoke is essentially saying he knew that Kylo had once felt conflicted. At one time, he couldn't fully embrace the darkness. He's not so much saying that this still exists within Kylo. What all of that was about was that confliction, that seed of confliction, was something that at this point in The Last Jedi, Snoke was seeding back into the mind and the conscience of Kylo for the express purpose of having that be a flag that would be waving in the distance for Rey to perceive and pick up on. By linking their minds, the one true estimation he wanted to bring forth and have Rey garner to influence and manipulate her is that there is some level of conflict still as yet in Kylo, within him. Because what would inevitably happen? She would inevitably, as she does in the movie, she would seek him out. She would seek to turn him in a similar fashion to how Luke had once done his father. And the whole point of that was to test, Rey on the one hand, to see if she was a more powerful apprentice than Kylo. If she could snuff out Kylo, here Snoke would basically have handed to him a stronger Force wielder on a silver platter. But it was also an extension of trying to uncover Luke's whereabouts. Snoke essentially knew the history of Ben Solo. He recollected back very easily to those first dark Force manipulations of him, pushing Ben to the dark side, consuming his mind, body, and soul with the darkness. And the one little last vestige of needing to get pushed to succumb to it, to commit to it, was waking up one night and seeing his uncle standing over him with a lit lightsaber. Without even trying to understand it, everything that Snoke had implanted in his mind and persuaded him to believe, to think, believe, and feel had come to fruition, had come full circle, and that was enough. That was enough of a push that he needed to embrace the darkness. And even then, he still had a very small, granular level of hesitation, of conflict, because he still is the son of Han and Leia. There is still an aspect of their heroism, their goodness of heart and soul and compassion. There is some estimation of that still in there, very minute, very granular, almost barely imperceptible. And when he's confronted with his father and he takes his father's life, the death of Han Solo in The Force Awakens, this is what eschews any doubt forevermore, any conflict forevermore. He fully commits to the darkness once and forevermore. And so in The Last Jedi, we have a Kylo who is said to be still very much in conflict. His mind has been easily bridged with Rey's, and they're communing back and forth, and Rey is getting this impression. But the whole purpose of her gaining that estimation of him, that he is still in conflict, is to lure her. Lure her away from Luke, and by extension, create a path, forge a path for Snoke and Kylo to find Luke, and to try to excise him once and for all from the galaxy, because of the goodness he represents, because of the light that he represents, because of his power. His power, as we see with that Force projection toward the end of The Last Jedi, is almost insurmountable. They must destroy him. If he not be turned, they must destroy him. And there was still every real legitimate fear within Luke, which is why he went into exile in the first place on Ahch-To, was because he knew himself imperfect. He knew 30 years from where we left him, he was still able to be manipulated. He was still able to have a fleeting, even just a fleeting, question and a bit of confusion about taking another person's life, but the life especially of a family member, because he perceived the darkness within him. If he was still that culpable and that weak and could still be manipulated in that such a fashion, the last thing he could ever let sort of permeate or escape that island exile is the power he wields. He could never put that power in someone else's hand. And he understood himself imperfect. He understood I could still potentially be weaponized. They could still create Darth Vader Mark II out of me, because I very nearly struck down my flesh and blood, my nephew. And so he's very much on that island, mulling that over and trying to understand his place in the world, trying to understand the sort of, misassociation of what the Jedi, the benevolent Jedi Order once was, how they become complacent and stagnated and blind to the evils that rose to power. And they were very much accountable for that. And he was trying to really wrap his mind around all of that while also trying to find his center again, because it had been thoroughly, thrown off kilter with the turn-in Ben. And then here he has Rey coming up, and the reason why he's so ornery and such an a-hole and everything to her for comedic effect most of the time in The Last Jedi. But the reason he is acting that way is he's trying so desperately to put her off to him, because he doesn't want to jeopardize this all over again when he hasn't even figured himself out necessarily. And yet, the Force within her, she is a new representative of what the Force equates to, because she can pass willingly from the light to the dark. She exists among both sides. There isn't one or the other. There isn't that conflict of pulling toward one or the other. But in Kylo, we have a villain who was able to substantiate what the Emperor wanted for Vader, what the Emperor had wanted for Luke. He kills, for all intents and purposes, seemingly, I know there's a whole theory going around that, this was a Force projection via Snoke. This wasn't the legitimate Snoke who died in The Last Jedi at Kylo's hand, that perhaps he's still out there somewhere, and it was a Force projection much in the same fashion as we saw Luke using, but of course from the dark side of the Force. And, I don't immediately dismiss that theory. I will have to see it to believe it. For all intents and purposes, in my headcanon, what we've seen on film is Snoke has been easily dispatched, and that is because Kylo rose to the challenge. If he had had any conflict internally anymore, that is the one purpose, the impetus for this video, is to eschew any concerns or fears or confusion in viewers of The Last Jedi who thought, how could Luke do this if there was still conflict in Kylo? The point is to say there wasn't. There wasn't any longer within him. And if he had not fully committed himself to the puerile evil of the dark side, he would not have been able to best Snoke in that moment. Whether Snoke had telegraphed it and knew it was coming and this was his plan all along remains to be seen. He might have been completely and totally blindsided by it, like we the viewer were, for the most part. But here we have Kylo substantiating what Vader was never capable of, because Vader still had the conflict. There was still light within him. The conflict that we see inborn in Kylo Ren in The Last Jedi is put there pointedly. It is seeded and feeded into his mind by Snoke, with the express purpose of luring out Rey and luring out Luke. That is the only reason it exists. It's a feint. It's a fakery created by Snoke, because he knows that at one time there was that granular confliction within Ben Solo, within Kylo. And he could use that and manipulate Rey and manipulate Luke and try to get them out of hiding so they could quell Luke once and for all, remove him from the equation, and have a clear path running toward that all-consuming power, that power to be reigned over the galaxy. It was all a manifestation of Snoke's implanted within Kylo, because that is something that Kylo once truly felt. The conflict we see, that aspect of where Rey gets the impression like maybe if I go seek him and I find him, I can turn him, much as Luke had once done with Vader. It was all a ruse. It did not really exist. It was there purposely to get her to come to him. And then, as I say, by extension, it would forge a path for them to locate Luke and remove him from the equation, take him out once and for all. Thankfully, it all failed. Kylo was very much expectant that Rey, feeling that conflict within him, which had been completely eschewed so long ago and was only a manifestation of what Snoke was manipulating of the scenario, Kylo still thought in that moment it was enough that resonated with Rey that maybe she would join him. That's where he extends his hand to her. And a lot of people were kind of upset that that didn't happen, that, you know, she adhered to the heroic light side, and she, you know, knocked his ass out and took off. It might have been interesting to see what would have happened if they had joined, but it is what it is. She turned him down because she understood, with him taking the life of Snoke, she got the full force, the full brunt force of the realization, the sensations through the force of his puerile evil, that conflict was all a ruse, temporary though it may have been, for the purposes of telling the story in The Last Jedi. It was a ruse to lure her. And again, by extension, to lure out Luke, or at least to pinpoint where he is in hiding, to end him. And hopefully, if you've watched this video, you've gotten a little bit a better grasp, if you had any sort of conflictions on your own part, watching the movie and thinking, but if there was conflict still within Kylo, even just minute, you know, shouldn't Luke have tried to appeal to him? But the problem is, all bets were already off. He had been well and truly consumed. There was no room for his arcing back away from it. It was a foregone conclusion. And Luke already had enough other things to deal with. His own weakness, his own failure to recognize the failures of the Jedi before him, which he was trying to recapture and rebuild and recreate. He's got so much more on his mind than just, can I save this young man? I don't feel like that's possible. And what about myself? What about what I've got going on internally? I have to figure that out before I can proceed. I am all powerful. I'm probably the most powerful force wielder in the galaxy, the known galaxy. And I've got dark forces wanting to manipulate me, and I almost succumbed. I've got to hide away. I've got to understand. I've got to take the time to rationalize and work things out for myself. And then we ultimately see Luke follow down that path. He has that character turn. He goes back to the heroic journey where we left him with his force projection. He stands face to face and toe to toe with Kylo, and that is his redemption. And so it's just, you could not have that emotionally impactful a story without such a brilliant and compellingly written villain. That is full form. There's no conflict. There is no question. There was some question for the purposes of the story so that our heroes, Luke and Rey, could be pulled out of hiding, could be lured out, so that those evil forces could find them and quell them, destroy them, kill them. But that conflict doesn't really exist anymore. It didn't really exist anymore. And so we have a puerile, evil, hateful, spiteful, very hot-headed villain. So hot-headed that, you know, there is a level of his potentially failing at anything he tries to accomplish, because he's going to be so impetuous. He's going to be so given to you know, thinking and reacting in the moment. So he might very well be on a crash course, you know, and destroy himself. He might implode in on himself. And again, you couldn't have that much of a convincing, compelling, brilliantly, you know, conceived character without that, just the way Adam Driver performs the character, the way it was written, the puerile evil there. We have always had evil in conflict for the most part. I mean, barring Darth Sidious, Palpatine, and things like that. And yes, we've had sort of mustache-twirling villains in the past. But the convictions are less mustache-twirling and less sort of classic movie villain in the case of Kylo. He is legit. He is the real deal. He is Vader, you know, a Vader that never had any reluctance, that never had any inborn conflict. He's like Vader unbridled. Think of that final scene in Rogue One of Vader unleashing holy hell on the rebels, trying to make their escape. Think of that times 100. And that is where we have Kylo. Now, he is still, youthful. He is still hot-headed. He still is impetuous. And these could be detractors to whatever he sets, upon himself to accomplish. But he is fully committed to the dark side. He was fully committed to it by the end of The Force Awakens. And we just see a renewal of that. That moment where he hesitated to fire on his mother and take his mother's life, that was part of the internal conflict that was implanted in his mind, in his body and his soul by Snoke. Because he knew inevitably it would reach Rey, and it would reach Luke, and it would force them out of hiding. Which it inevitably did, but thankfully plans did not seemingly go according to how Snoke had outlined them or conceived them. Unless, as I say, there's any weight and validation to that idea, that theory that's going around that Snoke isn't even really dead, that it was a forced projection of himself, and that he's really still out there somewhere. But personally, I would love to see, especially because it's Andy Serkis who played Snoke, I would almost love to see a Gollum-esque Sith-like, manipulation going on in Episode 9 when we revisit Kylo. Like, he's being burdened and haunted by this voice of Snoke that's constantly around every corner, that's constantly taunting him and calling into question whether he is as fully formed, as fully evil as we now know him to be. Constantly trying to create conflict anew, like, you think you're better than me, boy? You're nothing. You're a child. You're a boy in a mask. All those things that he was saying in The Last Jedi. It would be so scintillating to see a ghostly apparition estimation of Snoke taunting and ribbing and getting up in the face of Kylo to just add to a sort of sense of conflict. And I think that would be hilarious. As I talked with a friend of mine over on Facebook as well, the idea of now that Luke is presumably going to appear as a Force ghost, wouldn't it be funny if he was doing that to Kylo? Appearing to Kylo and mocking him and poking at him and trying to dismantle the full force of his evil to try to flame up some small estimation of weakness within the dark force that Kylo is, hoping that, when a Rey comes along, when a Poe comes along, when a Finn comes along, they'd be able to beat him once and for all and quell him once and for all. Those could be really intriguing aspects and hilarious aspects. I know people had some issue with the overabundance of humor in The Last Jedi. I didn't mind it for the most part. But especially being a third act, I would love to still have humorous moments, but maybe dial back on it a little bit and play up the drama a little bit more and the characterization and the interpersonal interconnectivity in the third chapter, where things are really tantamount. Things, we're moving mountains now, and it's about this puerile force that, in the case of Rey, it's not all light side. She is adhering toward the light side, but she is representative of a new evolution of what the Force is and what it's capable of. And I think we were hinted that. There was a tip of the hat to that by the end of the film, where we saw the child summon the broom to his hand. This is to say that the Force has evolved. It has grown. As life grows and evolves, it too has grown and evolved. And you don't anymore need specifically light side users, dark side users. There is an equilibrium, and you can exist as a Force wielder, a Force user, to varying degrees of power, very minute, just, sensing when your family is near, when they're coming home from a day of work or whatever, or after school, to being at the Rey Kylo level. But I think there's an equilibrium that they're hinting at, where it's not just so easily, boiled down to good versus evil anymore, light versus dark. It's not so much gray, the gray Jedi and all of that stuff. It's not so much a gray area, but it is a gray area. It is an undefined area where both are conceivable and both can exist within these beings, and that's our real world. We have good and bad in all of us. It is usually the good that tempers the bad, and that makes us capable of existing and living our lives. But it is a poor estimation of any human being, any life on this planet, to assume that there isn't a level of both within all of us. And so it's very interesting to me that that is, the contemporary commentary going on with characters like Rey and like Kylo. And Kylo, again, just the brilliance of his character is the fact that he is primordially, fully formed dark side, darkness, evil. He gave up any estimation of conflict he ever had with the death of his father. And any conflict, as I say, just to reiterate that point before wrapping up this video, any conflict he felt in The Last Jedi was implanted within him to lure out Rey and to create a through line to Luke so that Snoke and Kylo could dispatch him and destroy him once and for all. And I hope I gave you something to think about. A better impression of the story. If you had any conflict with how Luke could be brought to boil and could conceive, even momentarily, to take Kylo's life, I hope you understand a little better that the conflict that was raised within Kylo in The Last Jedi, it was disingenuous. It wasn't really his own conflict. It was there to spite and lure out Rey and Luke and destroy them. And by the end, with his taking Snoke's life much as he had his father's, we have a recommittal within Kylo Ren to the supremacy of well and true darkness and evil and hate and all of that stuff. And, that's pretty much all I have to say on it. Again, I hope I gave you something to think about. I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below what you think of this line of thinking, if you agree with me, if you feel like it's still not convincing enough to you. Anything goes in the comments below. Love it or hate it. It's all about the topic of talking about fascinating movies like this one was, The Last Jedi was, and fascinating characters like Kylo and like Rey and like Luke and all that kind of stuff. And, otherwise, it'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well. May the Force be with you, and I'll catch you later. Peace.